Welcome everyone to another episode of the Regenerative Health Podcast. Give you a quick update on what's going on here in Albury. We're coming into autumn now, or fall is what you guys call it in the US, and the temperature's dropping, but we've got plenty of beautiful sunlight, so it's a great place to be. In this episode, this week's episode, I'm talking to Belinda Fettke. Now, Belinda is a citizen journalist, and she has been researching the interests and vested interests and influences of the dietary guidelines since 2014. At that point, her husband, Dr Gary Fettke, an orthopedic surgeon in Tasmania, Australia, was basically charged with and brought before the Australian Medical Board for using low carbohydrate diets to reverse his patients' type 2 diabetes after basically seeing them have severe diabetic foot disease and which required amputations that he was having to perform. So after that whole saga, after which Gary was eventually cleared, Belinda did a deep dive into the forces at play and the influences behind everything that was going on. So this is basically a 1.5 hour talk about and discussion into the journey and the influence that has gone into where we are now with regard to a grain-based, vegetarian-based, and leaning almost towards vegan-based dietary guidelines. So it was a very interesting discussion with Belinda, and hope you all enjoy it. So thanks for your support of the podcast, and as always, if you're enjoying the content, please share it out and share it on social media and leave reviews on the podcasting platforms. It'd be very helpful. So thanks very much and enjoy the episode. Okay, I am sitting down with Belinda Fettke, who has done probably more work than anyone on understanding the dietary guidelines and the low-fat paradigm of the dietary guidelines and what factors have influenced them. So, Belinda, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Max, but I really can't take credit for what you're suggesting. Nina Scholes, Gary Taubes, there's a lot of other people who've done some incredible work into dietary guidelines. But as far as in Australia, I think I'm up there with you. Thanks.
Great. Well, we first met in, I think, 2017 or 2018 at a regenerative farming and kind of health evening. And there was talks about regenerative farming, and you were there with your husband, Dr Gary Fettke, and that's when I first became aware of both you and Gary's work. So give the listeners, if you can, a background on yourself and the story of you and Gary, and how you came to be so involved in understanding nutrition and the dietary guidelines.
It's an interesting story, Max, and as you say, I presented it that evening, and I think a lot of people were unaware, and I was an interesting speaker at that event because it was about regenerative farming and health. So I got up to present our story, and if you go back, originally I was a nurse in my past life, but gave up nursing to have a family, and we moved states a few times, so it was hard for me to work, and so I settled down to raise children for a while, 3 children, which was love of my life. And then I moved into professional photography. And I was used to telling other people's stories from behind the lens of a camera. I was fairly quiet in my past life. You might not believe it. But, that's where I was very happy and very comfortable. And my husband has been an orthopedic surgeon, was an orthopedic surgeon for nearly 30 years. And unbelievably, in 2014, he was reported to the medical board here in Tasmania, so the AHPRA Medical Board, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, for recommending his patient under his bed card in a hospital situation reduce their sugar intake. And if that doesn't blow your mind, when Gary was reported and he received this notification from the medical board, he just went, is this a joke? Surely they're not going to do anything about this. It was from a dietitian. And he just went, this makes no sense. But for some reason, the medical board determined that they were going to investigate. And in Australia, unlike in South Africa, where Tim Noakes was going through a very similar thing at exactly the same time, it was a very public trial. Gary's was all done behind closed doors. And when he was silenced, or when he received the notification, he was told he was not allowed to use social media platforms. He was not allowed to talk to his patients about nutrition. He was not allowed to talk to the wider community. And for the last couple of years, he'd been understanding the harms of sugar. He'd been understanding the benefits of a lower carbohydrate diet and including animal proteins and fats. But his patient that he spoke to in hospital under his bed care, he specifically just spoke about sugar. And if you appreciate, in 2012, 2013, there were 3 diabetic menus. The diabetic menu included 3 desserts per day. And Gary went, this is ridiculous. My patient is in here with a non-healing ulcer from the complications of type 2 diabetes, and their blood glucose level is just going crazy off the charts. We're having to employ people to come and keep checking his blood glucose, having to give him more insulin, calling registrars, calling different people. This is not healthcare. This is band-aiding sick care. So he went to the dietetics department in 2012, 2013, really excited. I've been working out through my own health and seeing in my patients that reducing sugar is really improving their health. It's stabilizing blood glucose and, in fact, even improving some of the diabetic ulcerations. And I think we can prevent them. So in hindsight, I'm not sure if the dietetics department at the hospital he was working at just didn't want Gary to be talking about it because that was their subject expertise, or whether they just didn't want him to be the first. Why were they so intent on silencing him? And it took a while for us to understand all of that. But in 2014, he was officially told he wasn't allowed to talk about it. After a 2.5-year investigation in 2016, he received notification from the medical board that there was a lifelong, non-appellable determination that he could never talk about nutrition in the public, at home, anything, which essentially, if you read into it, he couldn't even study nutrition to then back up his theories and his ideas. He'd been talking at Low Carb Down Under since 2013. So when he was silenced, he was told he would risk his medical license if he spoke about it, even to his patients, even talking about sugar. In fact, the only question they asked him in his one face-to-face meeting with the medical board in Hobart was, do you think recommending somebody reduce sugar is specific medical advice? And he was honest. He said yes. And that was it. Bang. You are never allowed to talk about it. So this was heartbreaking for Gary, because as you would understand, when you're an orthopedic surgeon and you're amputating limbs, it's maiming people for life. And to think that you could possibly offer options to improve health outcomes instead, and here's the medical board saying you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to improve it. In fact, in their determination, they said, he started with sugar, but as the investigation went on, they realized he was advocating low carb. So they said, even if low carb healthy fats, LCHF, becomes accepted best practice, you can never talk about it. Now, to me, what medical board can restrict a health professional from giving best practice to their patients, best health advice? So I went, whoa, there's something really, really, really fishy about all of this. In 2014, when he first got the notification, I just thought, this man's done so much. He's been through so much and he's done so much. Gary was diagnosed with a very aggressive pituitary tumor in 2000, and he required radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and surgery. It was advanced, and he does not deny that all of those things were necessary. But he developed diabetes insipidus, which is different to the diabetes most people would understand, and this is a diabetes where you can't concentrate your urine. So as a result of the chemo, the radio, and the surgery, like the mixture of everything, he developed this very severe diabetes insipidus. And in hospital, what you have to do is you have to match your fluid intake to your fluid output. So he was having up to 10 to 12 litres of fluid a day to try and chase this urine output. And the hospital staff said to him, "It's really hard to drink that much water. We suggest you have fruit juice." Now, in a hospital setting, when you're told certain things, even as a medical professional, you take that on board as being health advice. So he came home and he was drinking litres and litres and litres of fruit juice a day. He'll often say he looked back at the dietary guidelines from 1992 when he was studying medicine and I was studying nursing, and they were advocating 6 to 11 serves of carbohydrates per day. And that dietary guideline was not just, which they try to say now is only 1 slice of bread, but it was 2 slices of bread. So essentially you could have 22 slices of bread, you could top it with margarine, and essentially be having a healthy diet. And then he was told to have all this fruit juice. So he was very carb-laden. He totally believed the low-fat mantra. He only had skim milk. He had the margarine. Like, he cut every bit of fat off every meat you could possibly find. He did love a bit of chocolate. But, he couldn't work out why he kept getting so sick. It wasn't just his cancer. He started to put on a lot of weight. He developed high blood pressure and a whole lot of complications that you can put down to medication, but it just kept growing exponentially, like most patients that a GP would see.
Yes.
Once you start on that roller coaster of band-aiding sick care, it just grows and grows and grows. In 2011, so he had further surgery in 2004. Each time came through it incredibly, like he's a star. And but in 2011, they said, "We just really don't know if there's anything else we can do." And so he'd been on chemotherapy for 11 and a half years, on and off. And he determined, like a lot of other people, well, I'm going to go to Dr. Google. There has to be something out there that can help me. And he came across the work of Thomas Siegfried. And
Thomas Seyfried, in the US, yeah.
Yes, and Colin Champ. And just they started to make so much sense that potentially sugar is feeding cancer. So it was, I think, once he started to read about that, he also read David Gillespie's book, Sweet Poison, first saying, what does a lawyer know about sugar that I don't know as a doctor? Understanding that in medical training, you learn about biochemistry, physiology, all of those things, anatomy, in the beginning. And after the first couple of years, they take you down a silo of band-aiding sick care. You learn how to medicate and operate. And you forget that glucose, you forget that carbs turn into glucose the minute you ingest them. Gary, he gave up sugar upon reading this guy's work. And I reckon it took him 3 months to go, oh my gosh, I'm still eating carbohydrates. And they are essentially sugar. So within, 5 or 6 months, he'd completely given up all sugar and all processed carbs. He was very, very low on any root vegetable as well, but he still was including, and we still include some of the green leafy vegetables and different things in our diet a little bit, but not as much as we used to. We used to fill half our plate, if not more, with starchy carbohydrates, a little bit of greens and a tiny bit of meat. And that did not help his health. So for Gary, reducing sugar, reducing carbohydrates, including animal proteins and fats into his diet, improved his health dramatically. And once he saw that in himself, he wanted to offer that same option of health to his patients. And so I think I said to you at the beginning, it brought joy back to medicine. Who wants to amputate a limb and listen to that drop into a bucket? That sound that you're maiming someone for life, bang, into a steel bucket, and instead offering someone some dietary advice, some health tips to go, you can take back control of your own health, simply changing your diet. So in 2016, when this determination came down, it took us another 2 years to fight it. And the only way we could do it, because we couldn't go through a court of law because it was non-appellable. This is the medical board here has got, it's a law unto itself. And so it took us all this time. And I'd say one of the biggest advantages we had was that because they were coming down on Gary for something so stupid as reducing sugar, we were able to go to social media and just say, you won't believe this. The medical board's stopping a doctor from talking about sugar. Posted it everywhere. I started a website, isupportgary.com, and my hashtag was isupportgary, be noisy with me, all of those things. And I would say it was public support as well. I probably were getting humiliated for making such a stupid decision. And we had to go to the National Health Ombudsman. And the only way we could overturn Gary's case was to show that the process was flawed. But in the meantime, to show that the process was flawed, I decided to start looking at the vested interests and the ideology shaping our dietary guidelines, looking at guidelines from the 1940s and seeing the change in graphics from really an animal-based diet to a highly processed vegetarian diet. As Gary said, you have to send out a search and rescue party to find the red meat and dairy. And the Australian Dietary Guidelines is Eat for Health. So, why was this happening? Why was Gary and why were low-carb advocates getting hammered? Early on, I just said to Gary, I don't think this is about the science. I don't think this has got anything to do with the science. And I'm going to go looking. So I went from being a photographer behind the lens into a deep dive into the history of vegetarianism, into a deep dive into who decides what we eat, when we eat, and why, and looking at the dietary guidelines. And it's fascinating what I've uncovered in the last, nearly 10 years now.
Yeah, I mean, an amazing story. And I can only think about the psychological impact of amputating someone's diabetically, osteomyelitic affected toe, first one toe, then another toe, then an ankle amputation, and then a below knee amputation, and then an above knee amputation, and this all happens in end stage diabetic disease, diabetic foot disease, diabetic ulceration, peripheral vascular disease, which are all preventable manifestations of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes from consumption of processed foods, processed grains, sugar, seed oils. So, I mean, I can only imagine being in Gary's position and actually having to perform such a gruesome operation, and then knowing in the back of his mind that there is a very, very simple and cheap option for his patients that he can offer them. And I think the point that has to be emphasized is that Gary, it was just wanting to give this as an option. And when I talk to my patients about low carb, I'm not telling anyone to do anything. I'm simply seeing it as my job to give my patients the different options and then support them in whatever decision they decide to make. So the fact that Gary was basically being forbidden or prevented from simply offering his patients one lifestyle
tools.
approach, a tool, to me, I mean, isn't that, it was just, as you said, something was fishy going on. And I really, I guess having observed and talked to lots of doctors in the medicine low carb space, everyone has to go through their own journey to arrive at this treatment approach. And obviously, Gary had his approach, which he found that he discovered that cancer is a metabolic disease and one in which sugar and carbs basically feeds and potentiates the growth of neoplastic cells. So I think that Gary's journey is also reflective of kind of everyone else's, who kind of, once you see this, you can't unsee this in terms of a lifestyle treatment. But that's a fascinating backstory, and I can see how you went from a quiet, mom and professional photographer to the advocate and outspoken supporter of your husband, because the story that you described to me is one of grave injustice, and it's very, very fascinating, and that you are able to stand up and kind of right that wrong. So can we talk now a little bit about what you discovered in terms of your research, because it's so extensive, and I really want to give my listeners a kind of a really deep idea of what you have learned from maybe from the beginning.
Well, I'll start with the statement: when cereal for brekkie, hashtag cereal for brekkie, came after my husband, the mama bear came out, growling, Max, growling. And this is where it came to. I uncovered some documents in 2017, specifically. Oh, it was earlier. No, it was 2017. Sorry. This is what we were able to give to the ombudsman, and these documents were from a group of 4 cereal industry CEOs that used to meet up regularly. I think 4 times a year they met up to discuss different strategies, and that was Kellogg's, Sanitarium, Freedom Foods, and Nestle here in Australia. So they'd meet up to decide all these things. In 2017, and I'm not a techie person, I don't know how to hack into things, so these documents had been leaked or put online somehow. But I Googled Gary Fettke and cereal and Sanitarium, and I'll explain why I did that later. But when I did that, these documents came up, and they talked about, like, there's numerous documents. But the one that I discovered first was that Gary's name had actually been listed as targeted for active defence within these documents, these cereal for brekkie. It was the Australian Breakfast Manufacturing Association. The ABCMF had a branch called hashtag cereal for brekkie. And it was these 4 groups, and that was their umbrella. And they stated that they were going to target low-carb advocates, and specifically Dr Gary Fettke, the only medical doctor named, for active defence. And within these documents, I discovered that these 4 cereal industries were paying the Dietitians Association of Australia $23,000 a year to use their members. Now, that's a really important comment here, to use their members. So I'm trying to say that a lot of dietitians had no idea that they were puppets for this partnership. Okay, so that's important. A lot of dietitians, and in fairness, why wouldn't you accept the messaging that your accrediting body, your regulatory body, and your educating body, the DAA, is giving you as truth? So when they're told that advocates for low carb and people talking about reducing sugar are heretics, that it's dangerous information, they're going to believe it because it's come from their parent body.
But they were
covering these documents.
Sorry, I was just going to say they were disconnected from the knowledge that there was a funding source above them. That they weren't aware of that.
Totally disconnected from that knowledge.
Yeah.
And this document stated that the DAA were to use their members to influence, protect, and actively defend cereal grains and even sugars messaging. So here we've got there was a social media campaign, and the dietitians were meant to use the hashtag cereal for brekkie and post breakfast things. They were meant to get their patients, their clients, everyone to be posting this cereal for brekkie thing. So that is a concern in the first place. But to be using the dietitians then to report, within this it said, the DAA said that they were going to target low carb advocates, and dietitians advocating low carb would be accountable for this. So there was a dietitian called Jen Elliott at that same time. She got struck off for talking about low carb. She was a brilliant dietitian, did so much work. Again, like you, this isn't the one and only one size fits all, but I'm seeing with people with type 2 diabetes that if I support them, if I give them accountability and motivation, that a lot of these people can take back control of their health using low carb principles. So why were these 4 cereal industries coming down so hard? But not only that, using the Dietitians Association as their vehicle. So that's the fishy part that I was starting to uncover. The reason I went down that way is because the medical board had an expert witness assigned to Gary's case. And the expert witness was one of the biggest nutrition guns in the Southeast Asia Pacific region. We've got a catchment area of 120,000 people down here. Gary's a little voice. He's not in a main city centre. I think the issue was he was starting to get onto social media. We had a conference down here, and nearly 630 people had come to listen to Gary and others. He brought Troy Stapleton and some other people down to talk about low carb. He'd even brought Penny Taylor across from South Australia, and she was part of the CSIRO low carb research group, and she was presenting their latest papers on low carb. So I guess he was starting to become a threat because he was getting more well known, but really he was such a small fish at that time in 2014. And so why did they bring such a huge gun in to determine if an orthopedic surgeon could talk about nutrition? I must admit, Max, I had total cognitive dissonance that this guy must work for the sugar industry. And so I looked and looked and looked. I'd used social media for a long time with my photography. I was actually mentored by a young guy, and he just said, Belinda, social media is the place to be. So I had quite good knowledge of using social media, but I'd never gone to university. So I did nursing in the hospital system back in the day with the nurse's cap. And I think it's interesting that maybe some of the research I've been able to do and the places that I've gone is because I'd never learned the silo of academic research. So if something just didn't make sense to me, I went, well, I'm going to go look at that. That doesn't make sense, rather than, because Gary just was stuck in the science. I can't tell you. Gary, Low Carb Down Under, they just kept saying, but this is the science, this is the science. But they're not listening to the science, darling, so let's look at something else. So hence my research into a whole lot of things. But I guess the first thing I found was this man was working for Sanitarium, cereal company. Okay, well, he doesn't work for sugar, he works for cereal, of course. This is in 2014 I discovered he worked for Sanitarium. So we wrote to the medical board explaining, no, this is a conflict of interest. Someone can't be determining if Gary can talk about sugar and low carb if the person works for the cereal industry. Oh, the medical board wrote back, we don't believe you. I sent them screen grabs. Yeah, it's taken 10 years to uncover a lot of the things. So at the time I was very new, I was a novice, so I had some information, but not as much information, of course, as I have now. But this man didn't just lead me to the Sanitarium, which made me question cereal, but he led me to ILSI, the International Life Sciences Institute. His wife is working for that group, and it was founded by Coca-Cola in 1978 and is hugely influential in determining research in nutrition to doctors, to dietitians globally. So his wife was working for that. So, oh, okay, that's an interesting thing. So I went down the rabbit hole of ILSI, and I've been down the rabbit hole of Sanitarium, and I've been down the rabbit hole of a group called Lifestyle Medicine. He was working for Lifestyle Medicine, or he was their patron in 2014. So all of those things, I thought, right, these are things I'm going to look into and just question what messaging he's giving and why Gary's is such a threat. You know, what's it a threat to? Because it can't be about health. So Sanitarium was the first thing I started going and looking at. And even though I understood that it was owned by a church, vaguely had the idea, Seventh Day Adventist Church. I grew up in Sydney. And so the one big hospital owned by the church is the Sydney Adventist Hospital, the SAN. But they have a very, very small footprint here in Australia in comparison to America and a lot of other places. But it's a very, very influential footprint, but I had no idea at the time. I grew up in a Christian household, and so when I started to research that potentially a church could be influencing our diet, telling about the health benefits of nuts, fruits, grains, nuts and seeds, soy, as the gospel truth, and demonizing animal proteins and fats, I found it very, very confronting. And in the last few years, going back into the history of vegetarianism, religious ideology has played a huge part. So I'm not just talking about the Seventh Day Adventist Church. We've got fasting, we've got Catholicism, that it's no meat days. We've got lots and lots of things all throughout history that discuss what we eat, when we eat, and why. But the Seventh Day Adventist Church, I've come to discover, have a major, or they even wrote the research article, The Global Influence of the Seventh Day Adventist Church on Diet, in 2018. So understanding this influence was quite mind-blowing at the time, but I didn't talk about my research for 2 years because I didn't want to start talking about something that I didn't know enough about. And even after 2 years, I only spoke about it to Gary and my sister because I just said, you won't believe what I'm uncovering. A lot of it is very dark history, Max, and I haven't even talked about any of that because I think I'm really trying very hard to focus on why is low carb being demonized, why are animal proteins and fats being demonized, and why are cereal and grains the gospel truth. So I haven't gone down a lot of the dark paths, but I have the knowledge about a lot of them. And I think I was getting quite stuck on them at the beginning. So I just said to Gary, I just don't think I can put this information out. We were sending it to the medical board, but nowhere else. And Gary just said one day to me, he said, you have no idea the harm that's being done to my patients by dietary guidelines recommending cereals as the main source of carbohydrates, cereals and grains. He said, we have to bring this out in the open. So he was the first one to speak about my research. In 2017, in America, when he was still officially silenced in Australia, can I just say, in all that time the medical board was threatening him with losing his license, he never stopped talking about the option of low carb to his patients. He refused. He said, if they're going to take away my medical registration over something that I believe is so important to my patients, then they can do it. And I'll make a very big song and dance about it. So I'm sure they knew he was still talking to his patients, but he did go very quiet on social media and he didn't publicly speak in Australia. He decided, he was offered this opportunity to speak at the CrossFit Games in America, and he said, I'm going to do it because Tim Noakes is going to be there as well. We're both standing up for the truth. This is a really important thing. After he spoke, then I founded my I Support Gary website. That same, when he put it up, I said, right, I'm going to start this thing. And I think that made a really big difference because it wasn't just Gary advocating something. It was coming from, as you say, the journey that we'd been through together. When Gary got his cancer diagnosis in the year 2000, I hadn't made an adult decision without him. And I thought I was going to lose him. We had 3 young children. I'd been with Gary since I was 16 years old. And after watching what he'd gone through and his determination and his brilliance, he researched. He wasn't just bringing this out of thin air. He had done a thesis pretty much. In fact, there's a guy at Sydney Uni, he said Gary is probably his most enthusiastic biochemistry student he'd ever come across. He wasn't doing it as an official course, but he was asking questions all the time and researching, highlighting all the papers that he could possibly get hold of. He submitted all of this to the medical board over 2.5 years. And so I just watched him, and I'd watched him grow from someone who might only see an amputation, who might only need to do an amputation of someone's, as you mentioned, a toe, a debridement, starting back at debridement and non-healing ulcers for people with diabetes, once or twice a year at the beginning of his career. And in 2016, he was seeing someone every single week in his clinic at the Launceston General Hospital here in northern Tasmania. And that's horrific, those figures, Max. This is something you go, this is getting out of control. And when you realize that you have a tangible tool to offer to your patients, and he was giving them the support, the accountability, and the motivation. He was providing resource papers. We opened a clinic called Nutrition for Life. We had accredited practicing dietitians there, diabetes educator. We had health coaches. He was providing that totally encompassed support group for people who chose to go that way. And the medical board, poo-pooed all of that. So they said he was making money, but he wasn't. We lost so much money, I can't tell you. But we also had 127 other doctors in our northern Tasmania community referring patients to that clinic. And I'm so proud of the team who've continued on with the clinic despite Gary and I having to walk away. We gave it to them for $1, and they've continued to support people in our community with that message, which is fantastic. And I know I met Rob Szabo years and years ago, and in fact one of our dietitians went to work for him for a while. But this is an amazing opportunity for a very small community to have that total support, and the medical board ripped the entire thing out, and you just go, fishy, very, very fishy.
Yeah. So
So
I mean,
I'm jumping down a whole lot of different lanes
no,
here, but this is my why.
Yeah.
This is why I went into this research. This is why I've determined to speak to a whole lot of people about my research. So I'm not anti-vegetarian. I'm certainly not anti-religion. And I'm not even anti-religion for the people who choose to follow the Seventh Day Adventist Church's dietary beliefs. But I'm very, very concerned that these dietary beliefs that are based on an ideology, based on visions given to their prophetess in 1863, that she claimed were from God, are shaping dietary and health guidelines today without transparency.
Yeah. And to paint a picture for the listener, what we can see is that there has been a recommendation to base the diet on the grains, the carbs, the seeds, the nuts, the fruit, the soy that Belinda has described. And this has been enshrined in dietary guidelines since in America since the late 70s and in Australia since the early 80s. And the result of the widespread adoption of these recommendations has led to, in my opinion, and in people, doctors who practice low carb medicine, the widespread increase in overweight, obesity, diabetes, fatty liver disease, and a range of other metabolic problems. And these problems manifest in a whole bunch of ways. So I guess what we're seeing is that as a result of those guidelines, we're seeing patients sicker than ever and requiring medication and surgery at rates that didn't exist prior to those recommendations. Once we adopt an alternative approach, which is a low carbohydrate or carnivore type approach that doctors like Gary or doctors like I use with great success in our patients, we see that all these conditions, reverse and go away, and the patient's able to be healed. So the question and the fascinating implication of Belinda's work is that how do we get to this point? Why is it so widespread that a recommendation is in place that is essentially causing people to become sick and unwell? And when we look specifically at what's being recommended, those nuts, those grains, those seeds, those fruit, what we can see is that this is what was called the Garden of Eden diet. And this ties into what Belinda has previewed just now, which is religious doctrine or religious ideology of the Seventh Day Adventist Church. So I think this is a really great point, Belinda, for you to take the listeners into a bit of a history lesson about who are the Seventh Day Adventists, where did these religious beliefs arise from, and how over time have they managed to influence what most health professionals are recommending as a diet in Australia today?
I love that question, Max. I'm going to flip it on its side, though, because I think it makes total sense if you consider that the American Dietetics Association was founded in 1917 by the very first industry dietitian. She was the protege of John Harvey Kellogg and Ella Eaton Kellogg, his wife. They were based at the Battle Creek Sanitarium in America, and John Harvey Kellogg had grown up as a devout Seventh-day Adventist. So we're going into the American Dietetics Association. The co-founder of it was the protege of John Harvey Kellogg. So she'd been indoctrinated in the Seventh-day Adventist Church's demonization of animal proteins and fats. Incredibly, which I've just uncovered in the last year or so, the American Dietetics Association, that very, very first meeting, there were 8 industry people already there. And you consider that Lena Francis Cooper came from Kellogg's. And then you've got 8 other industries at that original meeting funding the activities of the dietitians from the outset because they wanted to create consumers. They already saw the ability to use dietetics essentially took the art of cookery, because it was home economics and cookery before that, the art of cookery into the science of nutrition. And industry worked out that if you had someone talking about the science, you had a woman, because back in the day it was just women in dietetics at the very, very beginning, they were able to talk to women about the importance of health. They were able to talk about their kids. They were able to talk about what to feed your children. This is a group that was founded, I would say, on ideology and a belief system, an industry dietitian, a group of 38, I think something like 12 of the very first charter members of the American Dietetics Association had either trained or taught at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and Lena Francis Cooper ended up, I think, teaching something like 800 dietetics students in her lifetime. And she wrote the dietetics textbooks that were used, I thought, for 30 years, but I've started to uncover, I think they were still used in the 70s. So she wrote them in the 1920s. This is a huge influence on dietetics that has come from a religious ideology. So I just wanted to really point out that fact before then I go back into, okay, so we've got John Harvey Kellogg now. So I've given you a little bit of an insight into the American Dietetics Association, and dietetics around the world has, especially ours, Australian Dietitians Association of Australia, was based on, as you mentioned, the Dietary Goals. We've followed America, unfortunately, demonizing saturated fat in 1977, and now potentially demonizing animal proteins with this next iteration of the dietary guidelines. So why the demonization of animal fats? I thought that Gary was in trouble for advocating reducing sugar and carb. I thought that was affecting industry, wheat, sugar, all of these things, big sales of cereals. But I was fascinated to find that he was in just as much trouble for advocating animal proteins and fats. And this goes back to, as you mentioned, the ideology of the Seventh Day Adventist Church and their belief in a vision given to Ellen G. White in 1863 that fruits, grains, nuts, and seeds were the God-appointed diet for man. And she took that message literally from Adam and Eve being in the Garden of Eden. And she said, if God had wanted us to eat meat, then why did he not give it to our first parents? When she was advocating this ideology, of course, there were no substitutes or alternatives to animal proteins and fats back in the 1800s. So she was pretty much telling people to eat a vegetarian diet. She had to include milk and eggs because there was no substitute and people couldn't really be healthy without it. But advocates of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, devout followers of the church, determined that they were going to work out how to get rid of animal protein and fats. They were going to research, invent, create, substitute these things because that would lead to salvation. And it's a really hard concept to consider, but Ellen G. White also stated that flesh meat will be done away before the return of Christ. Because in her mind and her teachings, she believed that when we go back to heaven, it will be like the Garden of Eden, and there will be no eating of flesh meat. There will be no eating of eggs or milk or any of those things. We'll just be eating the fruits of the garden again. Interestingly, she believed that flesh meat stirred baser passions. It created self-vice, which was the Puritan term for masturbation. She was hugely concerned that meat was a toxic stimulant as bad, if not worse, than alcohol or tobacco, caffeine, spices, all those things. To her, flesh meat caused masturbation, which was considered the most heinous sin in Puritan times. The temperance health reform movement, It started in the 1800s, and it was really Sylvester Graham, but we had the Bible Christians before that. But Sylvester Graham really brought it into American culture, and from that, the Seventh Day Adventist Church grew that messaging from him starting it. There were other temperance health reformers at the time, but she was the only one to bring it into the doctrines of a church. And flesh meat is warm meat. So that's why for a while also fish was allowed, because it's cold-blooded. But in essence, she taught the church that for Jesus to return, for salvation, all of these things, for purity, spiritual, moral, and physical purity, you needed to get rid of animal proteins and fats out of the diet as your goal to move toward. And you think, well, how can a woman that I'd never even heard of back in 1863 possibly be influencing what I'm eating today? John Harvey Kellogg was 12 years old when he went to work for the first family of the Seventh Day Adventist Church. His father had invested huge amounts of money into relocating the church to Battle Creek, Michigan. He founded their printing press because at the time there was no social media. The way to get the message to people was through print. So he funded that pretty much. He was a huge funder of the Western Health Reform Institute that the Seventh Day Adventist Church first opened, and John Harvey Kellogg became superintendent of after Ellen and James paid for him to do medicine. But if we go back to when he was 12, and I don't know how many 12-year-olds you know, Max, but I've had 12-year-olds, and they are really, really impressionable as to the messaging, as to the environment that they're immersed in. And you consider John Harvey Kellogg was typesetting the testimonials, the sermons, all of the things that the Seventh-day Adventist Church were promoting. But of particular concern, he typeset a book called A Solemn Appeal, and it was also known as A Solemn Appeal to Mothers. And this book spoke only of mothers deterring their children from masturbation. It wasn't just meat, but a huge focus on meat as the cause of masturbation and spiritual impurity. And she wrote all these things, and I don't know if this is where it's all come from John Harvey Kellogg reiterating it, but anything from masturbation caused blindness, which vaguely I've heard of as a bit of a folk tale, all the way through to masturbation causes the decaying of a head, it causes criminalization, it causes epilepsy, it causes dwarfism, like it caused all sorts of things in her mind. And he was 12 and he was typesetting all of this. And she wrote, or she had in this book that he typeset, it was as if you put a pistol to your heart and took your own life to masturbate. So I say in many of my talks that I do, is it any wonder that he committed his entire life to trying to work out how to stop sinful intemperance, to try to stop masturbation? And for him, bland food was a way to do it. He invented colonic enemas. He invented all this exercise. He invented electrical baths. Like, he did everything he could to prevent masturbation. But he invented foods to take the place of flesh meat, milk, eggs, and butter. And if you understand then that this was his life goal, he invented the very first commercial cornflakes and flaked wheat. So previous temperance health reformers had invented granola. They'd started to work out that they wanted to take flesh meat out of the diet, but as I say, Ellen brought it into the doctrines of the church. She determined that medical evangelism was the right arm of the church, and their health reform message, which includes demonizing animal proteins and fats, is the entering wedge to the church. It's a fascinating thing when you consider, and I think we briefly spoke about it, so I'm going to jump ahead to it very, very quickly, that sanitarium has been able to infiltrate what we determine in Australia to be healthy. They call themselves Sanitarium Health and Wellbeing Company. They were providing fact sheets for doctors in 2018 when I did my first talk at Low Carb Down Under, as I had a GP come up to me and tell me. They were providing fact sheets for doctors all I had to do was a click on their computer, one hit of a button, and out came this beautifully branded fact sheet for people with type 2 diabetes, for people with obesity, for people with chronic inflammation, for people who just want to lose weight, anything and everything, pregnancy, the whole works. Demonizing animal proteins and fats and promoting cereal grains and soy as what they should be following. These doctors weren't even considering that best practice and medical director just had it right there, sanitarium. I've heard since it's now a couple of steps away. You can't just click it, so you have to make more of a determined effort to go and get these fact sheets. And I attribute my being noisy about this fact. But that's unbelievable. And again, this is like the Dietitians Association of Australia, which is now just called Dietitians Australia, but like them teaching their dietitians the importance of cereal for brekkie. Medical professionals have been indoctrinated by the food and pharmaceutical industry. Their education has been shaped by these groups. And now that you find out the food industry is owned by a church, the Seventh Day Adventist Church own over 20 food industries globally, and they were founded to take the place of flesh, meat, milk, eggs, and butter. Ellen G. White actually came to Australia. I had no idea. She opened and founded Sanitarium. She actually lived here in Tasmania, and her son married a Tasmanian. So amazing history when you think of it. She was sent here for 10 years, and she was becoming elderly when she was here. So what she managed to achieve is phenomenal. But that's what Sanitarium was founded on, and it's based on ideology. They are young earth creationists. It totally disregards ancestral diets. It disregards evolution. It doesn't matter what you believe in. But when I've looked at who decides what we eat, when we eat, and why, and looking at biblical creationism, evolutionary theory, and creation mythology, the beginning of time began with man eating meat.
Yeah.
The Garden of Eden was a very, very tiny part of Genesis. It wasn't long before the fall. We're talking about a sinless diet, if you consider it as such. The Garden of Eden was a sinless diet. Adam and Eve hadn't sinned. Once they sinned, then you had to include the herb of the garden. So that was to heal, herbs to heal. But then you had to include animal protein and fat to develop and to regenerate ourselves, which is, regenerative farming. We need animal proteins and fats. We need those nutrients, those macronutrients and micronutrients to grow, to develop our brains, all of those things.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think their ideology is stuck in a point in time that does not support our health, and all their alternatives that they've invented, including the very first infant soy formula, because they didn't want people to be having cow's milk, they've all been created to support this ideology and to hasten the return of Christ.
Yes. It's an absolutely fascinating picture that you've painted, Belinda. And I think that if we think about their motivation or their actions from a physiological point of view, if you eliminate from the diet sources of animal cholesterol, animal meat, fat-soluble vitamins, you will successfully dampen libido. So, the precursor to the production of sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, is the cholesterol molecule. That is the human precursor to sex steroid production. You find that preformed in animal fat, in fat soluble derived vitamins, in liver, in all these kind of dairy, in these type of animal fats. So if you remove those animal foods, you are going to have less physiological building blocks to make sex hormones. So your body is going to be less responding with less libido. What that means when the body is less libido is that it's less ready to reproduce. So the body is not going to drive a physiological libido process if it doesn't have as much building blocks to successfully bring a child into the world. So that is the fascinating implication, that their religious drive to avoid this idea of self-pollution or masturbation was
Yes.
so strong that they were prepared to go to any lengths to reduce it, because as you said, Belinda, it was, in their opinion, preventing them from reaching some form of nirvana and redemption religious state. So they in pursuing that goal, they've managed to discard or criminal or essentially prohibit the consumption of the very foods that we require to be optimally healthy from a reproductive point of view. And
Yes.
we can see that, and people who are on a vegetarian or vegan diet, they get can have menstrual irregularities. There can be less robust sperm. I mean, these are all consequences of omitting very 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 essential food components, the animal fat and the animal meat, in the diet. So I mean, it's really interesting to me that the process of promoting soy consumption, promoting all these grain consumption, came from such a position of religious conviction. And it's not surprising
Yes.
that a group of people who are so religiously convicted can have such a disproportionate effect on the world. It's the rule of a very, very, very intolerant minority who literally are pinning their metaphysical dreams, their hopes of multi-generational spiritual existence on this work. So I mean, it to me that makes sense that they could have such an influence if they're so convicted in their belief set. So from this
And
position,
they founded Dietetics. They educate people as doctors, nurses. One of their nurses, also a protege of, oh, she wasn't a protege, she was a contemporary of John Harvey Kellogg at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. She wrote the nursing textbooks, not just for Seventh Day Adventists, but globally for 30 years. These people are determined. They're on a mission to promote this ideology. They came out of what was called the Millerite movement at a time in 1844 when Jesus Christ was supposedly returning to earth. And I think Gary made the comment that it's very interesting that Jesus' life was in Israel and in the Middle East,
Palestine,
and yet he was coming back to New England in America, which wasn't even founded, as his second coming. But there was a lot of people who believed William Miller. It was a huge following of his. And after he didn't return, it was called, in the Seventh Day Adventist Church, they call it the Great Disappointment. But Ellen came up with a solution to the reason why Jesus didn't return then. And she said that atonement hadn't been completed at the cross. So I think that's quite an important distinguishing fact as well, because for some reason, Seventh Day Adventist Church is considered a Christian church, but they have a lot of extra biblical ideas. And this very first one, that she didn't believe atonement was completed at the cross, she described that they hadn't got the time wrong, but they got the event wrong. And instead of returning to earth, he went from his holy place to his most holy place, and he's now judging people, which is also very concerning, because she taught that so the investigative judgment, this is what this time in life is called. And once Jesus has, say, Max, you've had your name read and he's gone through and he's ticked you off the list and forgiven your sins. But if he doesn't come back for another 100 years and he's still going through different people, because there's so many people to go through, potentially you have no intercessor. So you might have been forgiven for your sins up to the day that he looked at you. But now, say even if it's 2 years later, you've got no intercessor. So if you commit any sin, or you don't do the right thing, or you're not perfect in your character, you potentially could not go to heaven. So it's even more than just Jesus returning. It's a way of potentially controlling people to do these things. The church believes in total immersion. Every single person in that church is meant to be a medical evangelist. Every single person is meant to promote the health reform diet, whether it's just to your neighbor, whether it's in cooking classes, whether it's sanitarium, giving every doctor this message. This is beyond a belief. This is an intent. And they state in a lot of their information that I've read that the health reform message is an entering wedge into places that normally you could not open hearts to. So as a doctor, you can potentially start talking about a vegetarian diet, and that opens people's eyes to the health benefits of vegetarian diet. Oh, the church is talking about that. I mean, this is their belief.
Yeah.
And that's how they've gotten into China. That's how they've gotten into a lot of third world countries. And that's how they're taking their message massively into the South Pacific. At the moment, it's called 10,000 Toes Campaign, and it's meant to be helping people with type 2 diabetes, but it is demonizing animal proteins and fats. And if you look at the research and initiative they set up in Guam and the Marshall Islands, they even told people in Guam who were very, very poor they weren't allowed to fish. They couldn't eat fish because fruits, nuts and seeds have got a point of diet for man. I mean, how can you take something away that people can potentially do that doesn't cost them anything, and instead they've got to buy this processed food?
Yeah,
that is the concern, and why I'm becoming loud about all this. Sorry, Max.
An ancestral diet. I mean, that's you're essentially forbidding native people from accessing a completely free food source that is very nutrient dense and ancestrally appropriate. On the topic of using this diet as the thin edge of the spear, that's a fascinating concept. And to me, there are many different religions, and each have a different strategy of proselytization or bringing new members into the church. And everyone would have at some point in their life had a door knock from Jehovah's Witnesses, and there are other sects of Christianity that proselytize through missionary work. So it's just fascinating that particularly the Seventh Day Adventists have used dietary advice to enter, or use that as an entry point into converting people to their religious ideology, and hopefully reducing the total amount of animal consumption so that they can more likely become enlightened and saved. So it's so deep that the fact that the actual bodies that influence these recommendations were essentially a consequence of religious ideology. And I think that's a really key point that I want to emphasize to the listener, is that these bodies weren't established to solve a problem at the time. They were established as an apparatus to further a religious ideology. And in the early 1700s, I believe, ischemic heart disease or heart disease was just beginning to take off, and that was really coinciding with the introduction of seed oils in the form of cottonseed oil and other kind of polyunsaturated oils.
That wasn't until 1910, 1911.
Okay. So it was only 7 years after the introduction of Crisco that this organization was founded. That was not enough time to be responding to any public health crisis. This was an organization that was founded for that, for the religious reasons that Belinda has so eloquently and descriptively put to us. So I think that's a really key point that I don't think anyone realizes, least alone the doctors and other health professionals who were clicking the health advice in the GP practice software and kind of handing out a sheet of paper to their patients. So that's the beginning, and then we've got all the way up to John Harvey Kellogg. So how did we go from Kellogg, and I believe that was at the 1920s and 30s? How do we go to that to kind of where we got to in the 1970s and early 80s?
Well, John Harvey Kellogg became the superintendent of the Western Health Reform Institute in 1878, and he was inventing cornflakes and inventing cornflakes in the late 1890s. Then he went on to invent the very first commercial alternative to meat. It was made from nuts, and then he went on to make it from legumes. Just quickly, Lena Cooper, who founded the American Dietetics Association, her cookbook 3 years previous to starting this association, the recipe book, you could only make the recipes if you were buying John Harvey Kellogg's inventions. So he was selling them under his brands, sorry, John Ella Eaton Kellogg, his wife, and his brother William Kellogg all invented cornflakes. And his brother wanted to add sugar and commercialize it, so the actual Kellogg's brand became dissociated from John Harvey Kellogg, even though he'd helped invent it in the late 1909 or something like that. So it was completely disassociated from him. But he had the Battle Creek Sanitarium brand, he had the Sanitas brand, he had numerous brands that he was selling his inventions via. And the founder of the American Dietetics Association was creating recipe books that could only use that. So what she said was you needed to know the chemistry of foods to be able to get nutrition. And like you said, Crisco hadn't, it was so early on, Crisco was invented. The nut meats were so early on. The soy meats were so early on. All of these things weren't impacting our health necessarily. We're also going through world wars and depressions and everything else where calories were probably very low. And maybe, it's a really interesting time that coincided. But I look at the consequences of the temperance health reform movement, which was breakfast cereal and the fake meats, fake dairy. You've got prohibition around the same time, which really birthed the cereal industry. It gave rise to Coca-Cola because people weren't allowed to drink alcohol, so they went to soda bars. And that's where all the ice creams and the sugars and Coca-Cola just exponentially went off the charts. And then you've got the Flexner Report, which was funded by Rockefeller and Carnegie with oil money and steel money. But oil, that's when medication became such a big part of the medical education. And so they were using their oils to make medicines. Fascinating that Abraham Flexner, went around, and Rockefeller was determining that there were too many medical education groups happening at the time, and he wanted to cull it and essentially educate doctors to band-aid sick care. So something like 50 medical education facilities closed. And the reason I went down this way was because I thought, how did the College of Medical Evangelists survive this? Because they had just started out. And this accreditation meant that you had to do regular, you had to prescribe medication. And it was against the Seventh Day Adventist Church's beliefs. So in fairness, they taught sunshine, fresh air, exercise, as in movement, a whole lot of things that were very, very good. It's just such a shame that they focused in on this demonization of animal proteins and fats, because they coined the term lifestyle medicine back in the 70s. All of this concept, they had a lot of very, very good ideas. But because this overarching demonization of animal proteins and fats, I think it can't be separated from their messaging, because it's such a huge part that it's such a shame. But they got through the Flexner Report because they had to give in to a little bit of it. And the only reason they could do that was because Ellen G. White died. She died in 1915. So when this Flexner Report was really starting to put a lot of pressure on medical universities and colleges at the time, they gave in so that they could be accredited. If you look at their influence going forward, as I say, it was founded on the American Dietetics Association was founded on that ideology, and textbooks were written in nursing and dietetics and medicine. John Harvey Kellogg wrote a lot of textbooks, and a lot of people believed a lot of the things that he wrote. He was an anatomist. He described a lot of the biology of the body, and again, it's just such a shame he was so twisted in some of his thoughts and so concerned about some of the bodily functions that he created issues rather than just healing people. But he was the first person to wear a white coat as a doctor, and that's where the association came from.
And he had some quite bizarre behaviors. Sorry, Belinda, can you just tell the listeners about some of the bizarre behaviors and that he used to do?
He believed you had to have enemas at least 3 times a day. Again, it's going back to that masturbation thing. He believed any deposits in the bowel, any leftovers, would irritate the prostate for a male. And cause that feeling, oh, I need to touch myself. So he believed in a completely clean bowel all the time. So the massive high fiber diet. In fact, he talked with Dennis Burkett, who your listeners may or may not know as probably the fiber hypothesis man, and really pushed this high fiber diet in the 70s as well. So we've got a lot of overarching and symbiotic relationships between a whole group of people. But I think the Adventist message was dampened a little over the 1940s going forward. I think industry became very powerful, and they were demonizing sugar and a symbiotic relationship with the church, demonizing animal proteins and fats, because they wanted to push sugar and they wanted to push carbs. So the public health messaging of industry compared to the public health messaging of the Adventist Church became something that was very collaborative. And in 1947, there was a guy from the College of Medical Evangelists that went to Harvard University, to Fred Stair, and said, I would like to do my doctoral dissertation under you to prove the benefits of a vegetarian diet. And I can only imagine Fred Stair's excitement, having been paid by industry for many years to promote this exact message. He would have sort of embraced it. And so from 1954, their research was published and started to be talked about, was presented in Parliament, or in the US Congress. But I think industry was hugely involved in shaping the 1977 Dietary Goals. Interestingly, Nathan Pritikin, so George McGovern was the head senator who was pushing for these dietary goals to be published, but he was very close friends with a guy called Nathan Pritikin, and Nathan Pritikin pushed the low-fat, low animal protein, high carb diet, high fiber diet. He was very, very popular in the 70s, and he was such a close friend of Senator McGovern that he did his eulogy when Nathan Pritikin died. So we're talking about someone who's very, very close. But Nathan Pritikin, in documents that I've found, that he was actually an adjunct professor at Loma Linda University. So the College of Medical Evangelists changed its name in the 60s to Loma Linda University, which people may recognize now. Certainly if you Google Loma Linda University, you'll see it is, and the Loma Linda University Hospital, absolutely massive in this small blue zone in America. And so I would say there was some influence, and certainly Fred Stair doing this research with Mervyn Harding, they were taking this information back in, and the Seventh Day Adventist Church were getting back into the Dietetics Association, but they'd sort of been separate for quite a while because they say they don't believe in a lot of the processed food. But if you look, that's where they've gone. So it's very concerning.
Yeah.
But they pulled away a little bit and they made their own dietetic association for a long time. And they were quite powerful within their own realm, and where they were educating dietitians and nurses and setting them into mainstream hospitals with their ideas. So subliminally, they might have been around, but it wasn't until the 70s that they got back into the American Dietetics Association. And in fact, Kathleen Zolber became the president of the American Dietetic Association when the vegetarian position papers were all starting to come out and highlight that. And the reason it had happened is because the American Dietetic Association had a whole lot of hippies with the animal rights movement, and they didn't have the ability to support them. So they brought the Adventists back into that area to help them create those papers.
Yeah.
But I think Nick Motton as well, he wrote the Dietary Goals, and I've read that he was a Seventh-day Adventist. He may or may not have been, but he certainly was very, very, very pro-vegetarian. And from those guidelines, that was the start of the demonization of saturated fat.
Officially,
and then we've gone on officially.
And
now the guidelines are demonizing protein.
So I want to give the listener to add some even more color to that story. And so
Thank you.
What Belinda has mentioned about the 1977 dietary goals for the US, that was the single point at which a low-fat, grain-based diet was enshrined in an actual government recommendation. And that document in 1977 became the beginning point for what later became grain-based dietary guidelines of the US and then obviously Australia. So what Belinda mentioned is that the people around the writing of those initial dietary goals that again advocated this low saturated fat, high grain, high polyunsaturated fat diet were involved religiously in the Seventh Day Adventist ideology. The big point that we haven't talked about, which I think bears some mention, is that from the 1950s onwards, and even starting earlier in the 1910s, is that ischemic heart disease or coronary heart disease in the US had started to skyrocket. And this kind of culminated in a situation in the 1950s where President Dwight Eisenhower had a couple of heart attacks, and that at that point there was a scientific race to understand why everyone in all these males in US society were falling ill with coronary heart disease, because prior to the 1900s it was basically unheard of. And William Osler, who was a very famous physician in the US, early in their career they had no concept of ischemic heart disease. So from the 1950s, that was the point at which Ansel Keys, who was a physiologist who carried a hypothesis that it was animal fat and saturated fat that was driving this rise in ischemic heart disease incidence. So that was that diet heart hypothesis and the 7 country study, and this idea that we need to get rid of full fat dairy, get rid of animal fats, and start using margarine, start using the seed oils instead. So we're putting together the pieces of the puzzle, and we can see that the Adventist religious ideology was now being paired with, or kind of snowballing with, the scientific justification of a low-fat paradigm. And now, and Belinda mentioned that the hippies and animal rights were also being involved. So there was almost like a team being put together, like the A team was being put together, a motley crew of different interests who are all having a stake in, as you say, demonizing the natural human diet that we've basically evolved eating, which was animal protein and animal fat, and instead replacing it with these 3 disease-causing food groups that I think about, which are refined carbs and grains, refined sugar, and refined seed oils. So in 1961, it was the American Heart Association who issued an edict stating that they recommend all saturated fats be replaced with polyunsaturated fats. And they were actually taking money from, back in the 1948, they actually took money from Procter and Gamble, who had been making the Crisco hydrogenated cottonseed oil. So their ideology about promoting a low fat paradigm was based in profit, because they could make more money selling vegetable shortening and hydrogenated seed oil, cottonseed oil, than people would if they used lard. So that was the background to the scientific movement against animal fat and animal protein. And then by the time we came to 1977, we were running on momentum, the momentum of the low fat scientific diet hypothesis in the American Heart Association edict. But then you also had, as Belinda has said, a momentum from the Seventh Day Adventists, who are now getting re-involved and involved in this whole process. So 1977 is when the US issued the McGovern report and the dietary goals for the US. So where do we go? What happened after then? Because that's kind of brought us up all the way from the late 1800s to 1977.
That was a brilliant summary, Max. I will just iterate here too as well. Gary Taubes and Kristen Cairns, they determined that Harvard University School of Public Health was founded and funded by the food industry. So Fred Stair, whom I mentioned was doing the work with Mervyn Harding, he literally was a food industry man and determined to minimize the harms of sugar. and demonize animal proteins and fats. So it is that real symbiotic relationship between industry and a whole lot of factors that all happened around the same time. As you say, and not necessarily was it determined to harm people. It was about protecting profit, financial, and protecting a profit, Ellen G. White. And these two purposes met. The interesting thing is, from industry, you've got a conflict of interest, a very obvious conflict of interest, because you've got financial funding or your own stocks or whatever else happens there. But with the Seventh Day Adventist Church, the concern has to be a perceived conflict of interest, because it's not about money. They are doing it because of this desire to promote the health reform message, which is their purpose, and to grow the church, to hasten the return of Christ. Until enough people give up meat, he's not going to come back, they believe. So it is this real thing. And so I said 1910, when Crisco was invented, because candle sales were down, so they had to use their cottonseed oil for something else, and they realized when they made into bars of soap, it looked like lard. So that's where all that came from. You've got 1910 was pivotal, then you've got 1977, and to where we are today. I think it's fascinating that these goals were made, very much influenced by Harvard University. And Gene Mayer, who was a professor at Harvard University, he actually came out in the 60s and said low-carb diets are the most dangerous thing on earth. So this demonization of low-carb diets has also been going on for a very long time. Atkins promoted low-carb diets in the 60s and 70s. And we've got people who became very influential in shaping dietary guidelines, calling out Atkins, demonizing him, demonizing low carb. In Victoria, they actually had posters. It was the only state in Australia, or the only state, I think, the only place in the entire world, that it was illegal to talk about an Atkins diet, or you would be deregistered as a doctor. This fear of low carb has been happening for a very, very long time. Yet Russell Wilder was describing the health benefits of it in 1922 for diabetes, before he described it for epilepsy. So, we've come from industry, ideology, and, as you say, an ethical belief in animal rights, to really become this huge thing that all happened at the same time, and now is like coming at us like a tsunami and still not abating. And how do we work through this? And we try and talk about the science, going back to the simple science. We talk about ancestral diets. I think this, to me, the concept of lifestyle medicine embraces so much of what we do need to be talking about. As I mentioned, unfortunately, it's been hijacked by the church. And the American College of Lifestyle Medicine was founded on the grounds of Loma Linda University, and in 2002, 2003, became the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, but it was founded as the Christian Association of Lifestyle Medicine, CALM, originally. And they have become integral in demonizing animal proteins and fats and growing this lifestyle medicine message globally. We've got an association here in Australia, and while it was founded by Gary Fettke and a group of other people, it included Sanitarium as a sponsor very, very early on, and the Seventh Day Adventist Church has been very, very involved in its messaging here. They've just, on the 23rd of March, the Sanitarium, the Sydney Adventist Hospital, opened the very first Elia Wellness Lifestyle Medicine Clinic. And again, they provided all the information for the Medical Journal of Australia about the health effects and the importance of a vegetarian diet. So we're getting this message more and more, and doctors will start to receive more and more messages. They want to open 400 health hubs of lifestyle medicine, the church here in Australia. The church is involved in, Sanitarium, which is, got to remember, is a commercial arm of the church. As a commercial arm of the church, they don't pay any tax on their products or their services. And it is growing the church's message subliminally out there, whatever other way it can possibly be. But they've just joined up with Life Education, and they are providing the nutritional education perspective to life education, which is given to so many children around Australia as an educational resource through the schools. So we've got that arm, we've got all these other arms. But in America, the Adventist Health have just bought the Blue Zones brand, which I think is fascinating, and we'll probably hear more and more about it here in Australia, but at the moment it's in America. So the Blue Zones brand is based on the original Blue Zones that were founded by demographers Giovanni Pes and Michel Puller. And they were looking at the demography of areas that there were potentially supercentenarians. And they specifically identified Sardinia as the first one. And the reason it was called a blue zone is because when they were using their blue highlighter pen around this tiny area in Sardinia that had supercentenarians, it all became blue. So that's how scientific it was to describe this area. But these people were poor, they were geographically isolated, they were ancestral, they grew they grew some crops, there are obviously some fruit trees and olive trees or whatever else in Sardinia, but they relied on animal proteins and fats. They were shepherds. They raised pigs. Every single blue zone that was originally identified used lard for cooking. What's the only blue zone in the world that demonizes pig pork?
The Loma Linda
Loma
Blue
Linda.
Zone, yeah.
And it was identified by Dan Buettner when he joined up with the National Geographic. And I guess the point was, how do you sell a longevity pill to Americans? You can't tell them they've got to be poor and climb mountains and raise sheep and kill their own animals, slaughter their own animals and whatever else, that they can't rely on processed food. How do you sell that to America? He identified Loma Linda. And in truth, there are some supercentenarians and there are some very healthy people in Loma Linda, which is 1/3 of the population would be Seventh Day Adventist. And it is pretty much isolated. They have their own supermarket. Gary and I have been there, gone into the supermarket. It's unbelievable. It is all processed food, all fruits, grains, nuts and seeds, nothing else, fake meats, fake milks. The magazine area is purely about Ellen G. White, the Bible and their health foods. There's no other magazine that you can buy there. Fascinating place. There are some really, really healthy people in the National Geographic, and they've continued to highlight some people who are exceptional health, longevity, well-being. But people tend to go there in retirement, or they work there for a short time. They're not people who were born and grew up and raised, ate ancestral diets and died in that same place. That they came there generally because they offer fantastic facilities for retirement.
Yeah.
They tend to be wealthy people. So there's a whole lot of issues with the blue zones being named as Loma Linda.
Yes.
But they went to, so then Dan Buettner's commercialized it and has an actual brand called the Blue Zones, and they're trying to get it into a whole lot of states or cities in America.
Yeah.
I read that.
Sorry, Belinda, I'll just make a comment about the blue zones and the issue with, I guess, claiming that it's the diet that is related to people's longevity it's incredibly fraught. And that's another almost a whole podcast in itself, which is the flaws of using associational epidemiology to make a causal claim about diet. And there's so many other factors that are at play that kind of confound the association. And just because we have observed long-lived people in a certain setting, it's very, very difficult to disentangle the different contributions to longevity that living in a blue zone has caused. And things like a supportive environment in Okinawa, the old people are in Japan, they have very, very good community and social integration and inclusion right until their old age. There's all kinds of things like religious fastings, and there's all other factors that could have contributed to people living a long life in those areas. The other point is that they are often, as you've mentioned, you eating animal foods and animal sources of fat, which has been the norm in all human societies, and it was basically for the period of our evolution. So and then you have something called the healthy user bias, which is when we look at the long-lived people and try and draw an inference about what factors made them live longer. The healthy user bias is just observation or a phenomenon that people who are living that long are also likely to do other healthy behaviors in addition to eating a certain way, and that's not smoking, going to church, having upstanding morals, all these other things. So the point is really well taken that using the blue zones as some kind of advertisement or proof of the health benefits of a vegetarian diet are not founded on good science, and they're not scientifically applicable in any way, in my opinion, to make claims about what everyone should be eating. So I
But I
just wanted
guess
to
if you
make
look at
that
the
clear.
original blue zones, they did eat what we should be eating.
Yes,
And Weston A.
yes.
Price, which is where we went to that meeting, Weston A. Price talks about the original blue zones. Sally Fallon talks about different people who, and they've got articles on their website about people who lived in the blue zones, not Loma Linda, but the other blue zones where they actually did eat animal proteins and fats as part of their diet. And so I guess this is where I was going, is that the influence of the church, because they were highlighted as a blue zone. Gary got me to make him a blue zone map, because I was a photographer and doing Photoshop. I had to make him one for his talk. So I can't believe he was talking about that at the beginning and then didn't realize he was highlighting Loma Linda. But the concerning thing is that in America, they have a group of mayors who can meet up and make decisions. And there were 1,400 mayors at the US Conference of Mayors 2 years ago. And this group of mayors have to have at least 30,000 people. So they're quite large groups of people within their community that they're going to influence. And they have adopted the blue zones. Now, the blue zones is truly, it's only a template. It's an accreditation model that may be worked with different people in each community and slightly tweaked, but it's a template and it costs thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to become an accredited blue zone. But you have to get rid of animal proteins and fats in all of these cities, the restaurants, the schools, the hospitals. This is the infiltration of the church because they've bought the rights to the commercial blue zones project. And now 1,400 US mayors have adopted that. Once that gets adopted by the mayors, it goes to Congress and gets passed, and then it goes to the president. So we've now got the US not only have got their dietary guidelines, but they're now being influenced in particular cities by this mandate. I don't know if you've seen the sheet, but it's a 95% plant slant sheet that is now being delivered to children, to hospitals, to doctors, to anyone who's influenced. They become accredited if the shops sell less meat, less milk. They become accredited if their restaurants serve all these foods. And it's growing and growing. And I've read a couple of articles where they're trying to bring this commercial blue zones to Australia. So again, we've got to be listening out. We might think blue zones, Sardinia, Okinawa, all these places, they're great. But the underlying message is now it's been bought by the Seventh Day Adventist Church. It's going to be a plant slant diet that they push with all of those other areas that are potentially health and well-being. So, Max, I think this is such an important talk to highlight. And I love how you've been able to round out some of my discussions because I get very focused on what I'm discussing. And you've brought beautiful clarity to a lot of the context of my discussion.
Yeah, no, it's been a fantastic journey, and I think the listeners are really going to enjoy this kind of summary and history lesson, and really walking people through how we got to where we are. And look, needless to say, if people don't realize, or if they haven't been following my previous work, the idea of recommending a vegetarian animal-free diet to a children, in my mind, amounts to child abuse because of its profound lack of fat-soluble vitamins, essential animal-derived nutrients like heme iron, like the fatty acid DHA, like vitamin B12, all these essential components to thriving as a human and growing a healthy body and a healthy brain are being deprived in someone who's eating an exclusively plant-based diet. And the point that I've made previously is that one of the unintended consequences of replacing saturated animal fats as the chief energy source in the human diet has been the overconsumption of ultra-processed food in the form of seed oil, sugar, donuts, pastries, and soft drinks and soda drinks. Because as much as the vegetarian and perhaps the Seventh Day Adventist doctrine would like you to only eat grains and a whole food vegetarian diet, is my opinion that in the absence of sufficient fat soluble vitamins and animal fat for energy, people will seek out the other forms of energy in just a completely nutrient deficient way. So I think the overconsumption of refined food has happened because we've lacked the animal meat, the fatty ribeye steaks, the eggs, the cream, the butter. That absence of those foods has then contributed to overconsumption of the really unhealthy ultra processed food. So, Belinda, we've really painted a very quite a big picture here. Is there anything else that you want to talk about in terms of how the American guidelines and the actually got to Australia? Because we have described how they arrived in an American point of view, but how did they actually get imported from the US to Australia, particularly?
There was a guy who was a professor of nutrition, John Yudkin, in the 70s, early 70s, was advocating that it was sugar, not saturated fat, that was causing heart disease. He was in the UK. He was very, very loud, and unfortunately got called out by Ansel Keys. Like, he just said he was a charlatan and all sorts of things. Like, this message that was backed by industry and ideology about it had to be saturated fat that was causing heart disease. Just John Yudkin lost his position at Queen's University in the UK. And the person who replaced him was obviously a huge proponent of Ansel Keys and the saturated fat hypothesis. So when the Dietary Goals came out in 1977, he was excited to be able to give this to the UK establishment. And apparently they weren't so impressed. If only we'd followed them and not America. But anyway, they weren't very impressed. He didn't get very far at all. So he came to Australia in 1978, and he stated in his delivery in 1995 to the Nutrition Australia meeting that one of his goals was to bring the Dietary Goals to Australia, exactly as Ansel Keys had demonstrated, and they'd accepted this demonisation of saturated fat. So the Dietitians Association of Australia was very new. In fact, it hadn't even had that branded name yet. They were just developing in 1976. So it was a small, new establishment of a group of dietitians led by, would you believe, the expert witness of APRA. He was the first chair of human nutrition in Australia at any university. So this person who came from the UK became the second chair of nutrition in Australia and at Sydney University. The previous one was in Victoria. So we've got these two men who I believe were very supportive of Ansel Keys and the saturated fat hypothesis. And they were working with the dietitians. They had a meeting in 1978, and they wanted to talk about the dietary goals that had just been established, and they did a big push, and they asked around and there wasn't much pushback, so they decided to form their own committee and draw up Australia's first dietary guidelines. Then after they'd done it and they presented it at a meeting in 1979 to a group including the food industry who were very supportive, there was no problems there, they presented it to the NHMRC, the National Health and Medical Research Council, which are the gatekeepers of our dietary guidelines. And apparently they were a bit pissed off, could be a word, that they weren't included in creating these dietary guidelines or consulted at all. There was no scientific background literature review. There was nothing. This group in 1978, the two chairs of human nutrition and the dietitians got together and created these dietary guidelines based on what was happening in America. And the NH and MRC adopted it. They didn't question. They didn't do any review or anything. So wham, bam, we just got those dietary goals. And when you consider what influences created those goals and guidelines in America, it's very concerning that they were just adopted here. I think what's interesting is that the person who'd come from John Yadkin's seat over to Australia was in 1995 reflecting on the success of the dietary guidelines, saying how cheap they were for governments to be able to produce, and just a few meetings, get a secretary together, write them up. And then he had the audacity to state, and then just sit back and wait for them to work. He believed that cardiovascular disease had decreased massively, yet the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, I think that was the name of it, came out in 2019 with a report saying 42,800 people in Australia had died with underlying cardiovascular disease.
Yeah.
1/4 of Australians had died. Where did the guidelines help? Were we all meant to die from cardiovascular disease? I just think it's really interesting. And he stated that the sugar hypothesis was just null and void, and that it was always saturated fat. And I think to have this minimization of the harms of sugar and carbs and whatever else, and the demonization of saturated animal proteins and fats as the basis of our guidelines with no scientific background review and just carried through. Gary looked at the 2013 Dietary Guidelines review, and it was so biased. I don't know if you're aware, Max, but the questions that the Dietitians Association were asked to review, they reviewed 55,000 literature articles and research. And within it, they were only asked to look for the health benefits of cereals and grains. So not health and well-being and negative effects, but just the health benefits and the harms of red meat. So if you do a literature review and you only look up for those things and you come back with your results and your report just says meat's bad and cereal and grains are good, but you don't understand that they were the only questions that they were asked to look at, oh my gosh, it's so concerning.
Yeah, isn't it? And I had a look at a graph of the percentage of adults in Australia who are overweight and obese, and it's plotted by time, and you can see from about 1980 to 2017, and I believe the incidence of overweight and obesity, the proportion of adults went from something like 13% in the early 1980s, and it was well over 27, maybe up to 30% by the time the data was done in 2017. And if you just plot the subsequent editions of these guidelines on that curve, there's no attenuation of a trend that is just continually up and to the right. So anyone, if we're thinking critically, we have to really try and understand why that is the case. And when you understand the biochemistry and you understand the hormonal model of obesity, and you understand the effect of glucose and carbohydrate and sugar on insulin and insulin resistance, and adipocytes, and hepatic steatosis and the development of metabolic dysfunction, you can really fundamentally understand that these grain-based recommendations not only were, accessory to this trend, but they're actually probably causative. And I think that is something that we're only, starting to recognize on a wider scale as things like low carbohydrate becomes more widely accepted and adopted as a treatment option. I want to wrap the conversation up with a bit of a summary, because I think we've covered so much fascinating ground. And I want to make the point that, as Belinda has just mentioned, the importation or the imposition of guidelines in Australia was simply a reflection of what was occurring in the US. And every other country has basically just cloned the essentially what was the 1977 McGovern report. That's gone through a slightly amount of iteration, but it's essentially unchanged, which is the low fat paradigm, low animal fat, low saturated fat, low animal and now low animal protein, and that has just been replicated and duplicated in all around the world, and the use of polyunsaturated seed oils, which is something that we haven't talked a lot about, I believe is driving a massive amount of this metabolic disease and obesity. And essentially every single country, in Australia, ours is canola and sunflower, but in the US it's corn and soy oil. Every single country has their own brand or version of a high linoleic acid seed oil that they're using instead of animal fat, and the consequences for our metabolic health collectively is catastrophic, and is continuing to go in that way. So to tie this whole conversation up, I guess what we've talked about is that the guidelines which most people are being told to follow and have been followed, which are the low-fat guidelines, had their genesis and their origin in religious doctrine and ideology of the Seventh Day Adventist Church that began in the late 1800s and has progressed throughout the 20th century, and reflected in the development of corporate grain producing companies and food companies and Kellogg's and Sanitarium and all these entities who have simply developed products and pushed a low animal fat, low animal food agenda in pursuit of adherence to a religious ideology that believes salvation of the individual relies on making the collective society reduce their intake of animal protein and animal foods. So, I'd just like you, Belinda, if you have anything else or any final, parting messages or thoughts, and then maybe give a handoff to where the listeners can hear you and read your work.
Thanks so much, Max. I've really, really appreciated being here with you and having this discussion. And as I say, I really love your thoughtful commentary in between it. It rounds it all out and just it takes it to a really good place. It makes it very understandable. I think there are a couple of men in my research that I've looked back and thought, wow, these men have been real change makers in time and have stood up to what they believe in forever. And so tying in, because Harvey Wiley fought against Coca-Cola for a very, very long time. He was a chemist and part of the Pure Food. He passed the Pure Food and Drug Act back in the early 1900s. And his nemesis, he was also fighting, against straw and sawdust being put into meat compounds. And there's a whole lot of things. It was a big range of foods that he was trying to navigate through. But his big nemesis was Coca-Cola at the time. And he was trying to get the cocaine out of it because he could see that there was a lot of crime rate and all these other negative influences from the cocaine portion of the Coca-Cola, not necessarily the sugar back in those days. But he even took Coca-Cola to court and still lost. And with the Pure Food and Drug Act, no matter which level they took it through to Congress, there was someone always being paid off by Coca-Cola to cull and nullify every attempt. So in the end, he just determined that policy was never going to get him anywhere. The government was never going to make the decision about what was good and what was bad because they were too conflicted by funding and influence. So he took it to the people and he went and worked for a women's magazine. And he wrote in a column because he thought it was best to take his message to the people who at the time in the early 1900s would have been predominantly the women purchasing foods and things for their families. And I just think this is exactly what we're doing now. It's all very well for us to challenge, and I'm working with James Mukey and Gary and Peter Bruckner and a few other people at the moment, Claire McDonald-Lou, Liz Fraser, to try and put a submission into the NHNMRC about the update of the dietary guidelines and bringing in scientific points and different things. But whether they listen or they don't, you never know. But your podcast, hopefully, I'm taking it to health professionals who will start to question their education and this demonization of animal proteins and fats. Harvey Kellogg just took it to the people, and he had 12,000 women march on Congress. And that was why cocaine was taken out of Coca-Cola, not because of policy, not because of government. So I think the grassroots, the people, like Western Aid Price, have developed this incredible groundswell, and so many of us have caught on from that as well. But this is where we're at. We've got to help people understand how important this messaging is, and as you say, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So if you can do that, and now we need to be able to offer people, I call it SAM, support, accountability, motivation. This is where we're taking people, and this is part of the support, the motivation and the accountability, hopefully. But yeah, thanks so much, Max, for doing it. And we're following on the shoulders of many, many people who've gone before. But I think right now we're in a really good place to push, and definitely diabetes guidelines. I think there's a real chance for us to get it. I know James Mukey's been working on incorporating it at least as something that's acceptable. And so the next level is to take it to a tool that can be offered safely, and no doctor fears recrimination from it. But how can we get this tool in as an option to support people to take back control of their health?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's about patience. And to round this conversation off,
Absolutely.
finally, it's about patience. It's about alleviating suffering. It's about giving patients the option and ability to heal. And if this discussion can help in that even a little bit, then it'll be well worth it. So Belinda, how can people find you if they want to read more about your work or find out about where you're doing all your work? How can they get in touch?
I'm quite. I use LinkedIn quite a bit, and I've got a Facebook page. It was called Gary Fettke No Fructose. It became Belinda Fettke No Fructose, but I couldn't really do the science that Gary was doing. So yeah, it's had a couple of reiterations. It's Belinda Fettke Low Carb Healthy Fats at the moment, but I do talk about my research, so it's tricky. But LinkedIn, a little bit of Instagram, but I'm in the process of developing a new website. My previous website was I Support Gary, and Nina Teicholz and a few other people have said to me they can't really share my articles very easily because who wants to hear about some woman who loves Gary? So I'm moving into a space where it's called just belindafetke.com, and I'm so close to launching it, hopefully in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And that will be a lot of my research. Even though I truly love and support Gary, it's about my research and who's deciding what we eat, when we eat, and why. So hopefully I can give the link to that soon, coming soon.
Great. All right. Well, I'll include all that information in the show notes, and you're on Twitter too, so I'll put that in the show notes too, so everyone can follow you. So, thank you so much, Belinda, for sharing your amazing research and all your hard work with the listeners, and we all appreciate it and appreciate you so much. So, thank you.
Thanks, Max. I did it, as you say, I did it for people. It was a social justice. Gary was wanting to stand up, and he was being knocked down, so I wanted to work out why he was being knocked down. But yeah, it's about our communities, it's about our patients, it's about our friends, it's about our family. So let's make a difference.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. See you later.